to say, no, you cannot extend it, to prevent them extending it, because they haven't got the service facilities there for the ground to be properly serviced. Now, I think that the government was well within its rights. In fact, I think it had a duty to deny the league the right to extend the ground and make it larger. But I do not believe that the Premier or the government had a right to say you have to play at the Melbourne ground, despite the public clamour, despite the lot. I believe it was the league's grand final. They should have been able to play it where they wanted to. I think it would have been foolish, and I think if they hadn't extended the ground, and the government, as I say, was properly entitled not to allow them to do so, they would have come back here after 2 or 3 years, for certainty, and everything would have been just as happy.
Again, as I'm sure you're aware, and probably better than anybody else, the thunderbolt was the assertion that VFL Park should never have happened, and would never have happened, other than for the intransigence of the MCC.
Well, I think that's, yes, I've heard that, but it's not quite correct. The actual history of that was, it goes back to Ken Luke and Arthur Caldwell. Luke, I'm quite sure, was terribly frustrated that Carlton did not get the Olympic Games. And he had a bit of an ante against the trustees, not against the club, against the trustees because of that. And it was John Kane Sr. who said, because of the wastage of materials and that, unless the games are held at the Melbourne ground, the state will not give any assistance. And so it was, Carlton had already started constructing their stadium. Now, there was an antipathy between Ken Luke and Arthur Call and Stanley Lewis, who was the secretary of the trustees, a QC incidentally, and it was this bitterness between them more than any antagonism to the MCC which caused the friction in those early days. For instance, when the 57 agreement was being negotiated, I came in during that period, and the trustees wanted to charge the league 15%. The club was happy to pay the league what it was prepared to pay, 12.5%, but the trustees insisted on the 15. Then the club made a suggestion that what they should do is, okay, we'll charge the 15, but we will refund to the league an amount equivalent to that 2.5% to reduce the real value down to 12.5. The trustees wouldn't agree to that. And I think this was the friction, where the friction started.
And reserve seating, as I recall it, was also a stumbling block.
Yes, that was a rather funny one, actually. The league played ducks and drakes a bit there. I remember on one occasion that they came and they said they wanted all of the reserved seats. Well, the trustees wouldn't give them all. They said there have to be some for the public. And Ken Luke argued, and anyhow, after the BJ decided to appoint a subcommittee to look into the matter. And the late Gil Chandler, who was Minister for Agriculture in the Boldy government, he was appointed as chairman of this committee, and he said to Ken, now look, tell me, Ken, how many seats do you really want? Ken said 70%. I think that was a figure, I think it was 70%. You sure that's all you want? Yes, that's plenty for us, that's okay. Fair enough, good. So Ken drove myself and Murray Gibb back from the trustees meeting to the ground that day. And I said, are you happy with the 70%? Oh, he said, yes, I don't want them all. He said, gosh, he said, with all of the criticism you get, let the trustees have the criticism, we don't want it at the league. Oh, I said, you don't want them all, Ken? No, we don't want them all, of course not. Well, that's all right, but that night, no, not that night, the following week, that's right, they came back to the trustees, and the recommendation was for the league to get the 70% Ken asked for. They were given the 70%, and Ken was as happy as a sandboy. He went back and saw Eric McCutcheon, and that night Eric was on TV abusing the daylights out of the trustees because they didn't give the league all of the tickets, when in fact they'd given Ken exactly what he'd wanted, and he didn't want them all. And they were the sort of little things that came into it which annoyed Arthur Caldwell and Stanley Lewis, obviously, and it annoyed me a little bit too, actually.
So there was rancour developing between the MCC as a whole and the VFL? I
think there was a bit of annoyance because of the fact that the league was not playing it straight in our book.
Did this affect you personally in your relationship with the VFL?
Not really. It did when we were doing deals, but socially it had no impact whatsoever. We felt, well, one's one thing and one's another. It didn't worry me at all.
The MCG is a world-class facility. How does it compare?
Oh, there's no doubt about it. Comparing size at rates with any of them, I think that probably you'd have to say that, until recently anyhow, that from a comfort point of view it didn't compare with the stadia in America where they might only hold 50, 60,000 people, but they did have more luxurious appointments. But the MCG now is developing into the way where it's becoming right up with all of those other stadia in the matter of comforts and general facilities. I know there was one talk often spoken about the toilet facilities here. That was a great lot of waffle because I saw many grounds in America and their toilet facilities were not as copious as the Melbourne. We had a lower ratio of people per toilet than they had in America. And I think probably they were used more here because the people drank a bit more at functions until they got this 2-can rule in. But that was a misrepresentation of the facts. But generally speaking, the MCG does rate, comparing its size, it rates as one of the really great stadia of the world.
Now, the government's equal rights legislation, which was only introduced a couple of years ago, now allows for women to be in the MCC membership. A thorny problem?
Well, I think the way the government went about it became a thorny problem. Now, I'm speaking personally, only my own personal views here, Tony, because the thing came about just at the end of my time, and I had a confrontation with the Premier John Cain about it. They wanted women to be given an opportunity of membership immediately. I objected to that. I said it's equal rights, it's not preferential rights. Because if chaps have to wait 20 years, well, so should the women. They shouldn't get straight in. I was prepared to go along with an idea which I had suggested about 5 years previously, actually, and that was that a man with a ladies' ticket should be able to nominate a woman as a member in lieu of his ladies' ticket. That, I think, would have been fairly legitimate, and the committee did adopt that about 5 years after I suggested it. But as regards having women come in and get preference over the men on the waiting list, I don't think there's any excuse for it at all, and I think the government was unfair about it, unfair to the men who had been on the waiting list, and I think they were unrealistic in their attitude about it. But it's obvious that women had to become members of the club. It's quite obvious in this day and age that it was a fact, but I think the club has lost something because of it. Now, that's probably a bit of chauvinism rearing its ugly head, and after all, I'm in the age group where chauvinism probably does apply. But I do think that the club did lose something with that. I think sport's a place where men should be together and women should be together, and if they choose, they can be with each other.
The MCG trustees are appointed for life by the government, so that makes them really a political group, not a sporting group. Is that a handicap?
Not really. I think, first of all, let's say, Tony, that they were appointed for life, but I believe that a new act was brought down whereby all of the appointees before the act are still going on for life, but appointees subsequent to the act retire at 72, which is the same as a board member. Now, I don't think it matters. I mean, there's enough sporting background in the MCC committee to run the place, and remember that the MCC committee runs this ground. The trustees are there to look after the welfare of the public and to make sure that the club doesn't exploit the public. Now, that is their prime task. The ground was granted to the MCC in 1853 by Governor La Trobe. Now, the club has legal opinion. Isaac Isaacs gave an opinion whereby that meant nothing, that it was still Crown land and the government had control of it. But we also had other opinions, one from R.G. Menzies, one from Fulligar, to the effect that that grant was given under an imperial act, not under a colonial act or one of the later acts. And because it was given under an imperial act, the club had rights in perpetuity to the ground. Now, the imperial acts have all been done away with now, and the government has got its right to sort of say what happens at the ground. But the trust has always been, or always in my time, was a very cooperative body. They were there, as I say, to look after the interests of the public. The league was complained because they had to approve prices, but that's fair comment. The fact is that on any Crown land, and I'm sure this will happen in the new tennis centre, that the trustees will have to recommend to the Governor in Council the ceiling price for tickets, because it is Crown land. It happens at Olympic Park, it happens everywhere on Crown land. And that is just one of the consequences of being on Crown land. But the trustees have always worked, or in my time anyhow, always worked very well with the club, and were most cooperative. Arthur Call, we found, Ken Luke didn't find him as very cooperative, but we always found him very cooperative. And Henry Bolte, of course, was always very cooperative. I believe he stood down now and Lindsay Thompson's taken over.
It became necessary for the Melbourne Football Club, which had always been embraced under the umbrella of the MCC, to become separately incorporated. Why was that, and was it a problem?
Well, there were some embarrassing moments at that time. The MCC founded Australian football. It helped to set up the Melbourne Football Club, and I think it was around about the 1880s or something, the Melbourne Football Club asked the MCC to take them over, and the football club did in fact become a section, an autonomous section, admittedly, of the Melbourne Cricket Club, but autonomous only to the extent that they could act themselves, but they had to get approval for everything subsequently from the MCC committee. Well, with the explosion in the costs of football, we found that the MFC committee, and it was a committee which there were people there whom we didn't hold in particularly high regard. They were a bit reckless in their spending habits. And we found that what could easily happen was that they could commit the club for vast, vast sums of money, and the club would have to be responsible because the football club was not incorporated. And so I suggested, and the committee agreed, that we should get them incorporated. We didn't quite know how to go about it, but then, because a couple of them wanted to be independent over there, they decided they wanted to become incorporated. Well, we went along with it. And then they wanted to be a separate body. And in fact, one of their committee, who became a very prominent member of the club, did in fact resign because they weren't pushing ahead with the incorporation and the separation from the club, because there were still members of the football club who realised the implications of it. But this chap, Dick Seddon it was, he resigned because they weren't going to do it. And anyhow, they finally broke away and he then came back. But it was a necessary thing, because while the club would like to have had it as a section still, it was really becoming impossible because of the cost of football. But with the new administration they have there, there is a much closer affinity between the two again now, and I think that will go on as a very happy relationship, even though the football club will retain its independent status.
Another matter in this latter half of the 1980s, the installation of this state-of-the-art scoreboard.
Oh, yes, well that's been a great success. I suppose I had something to do with that. Well, I went to America around about 1977, I think it was. I first of all called off at the Aloha Stadium in Honolulu, and they had one of these boards, and I was absolutely fascinated by it, with the things that they were doing with it. And I found out that they had got the thing free of cost by letting out the advertising rights to the people supplying it. And I made some inquiries about the deal, then I saw them at other places in America. And I had the impression that there was a colour content about it, even though it was sepia only. Anyhow, I came back, and then they were getting one in the city square, and John Mitchell, one of our committeemen, he was sitting at the Lord Mayor's dinner one night with the two architects. He told me about it, so we went and saw them, and we got the rundown on the board. We saw a chappie named Bob, I can't think of his name. He used to handle the advertising for America, from America for it. He'd already done a deal with the VFL, and anyhow I saw the one in the city square, and I started to lose a little bit of interest in it because of the sepia tonings, and also because of the conditions of the agreement that was necessary, and the maintaining of the board and the running of the board. But then we got a letter from Mitsubishi talking about the colour board that they'd invented. Well, we immediately got interested in that again, and well, it just followed on from there. I went up to Japan, had a look at it. There was only one in the world, and that was at the Dodger Stadium in Los Angeles. And I went to Japan, saw it up there at their display, and was sold on it. And the president was up there a couple of weeks later. I got him to have a look at it, and of course the committee agreed with the idea. We got a much better deal from Mitsubishi, and the thing has worked out wonderfully well, as you will agree.
Absolutely, and I recall with a good deal of humour that the cue in these modern times to light up that marvellous facility was given by you lighting your pipe.
That's right, a smoke signal went across there. Yes, I was rather proud of that one.
How did the MCC justify $4 million or whatever it cost, it was something like that, in putting in lighting when our weather sort of dictates that you can only use the facility for 5 or 6 weeks a year?
Well, I think it was generally reckoned that sport this day and age had to have night sport, and there had to be lighting for night sport, and it had to be proper lighting. That is, I think the angle's around about 27 degrees from the centre and 15 lux or something or other. And the MCC thought about this in the late 70s and even almost accepted a tender from Philips. Had plans of the ground, had a mock-up design with the lights. Everything was done. We did a feasibility study, an environment effects study. So I went onto the back burner, but it was revived again just before I left, and we went further ahead with it then, and after I left, the lights were put in. And that was the general thought. It was just a fact that in a modern stadium, you needed lighting.
And as with the scoreboard, it's a fantastic facility.
Wonderful facility for it, yes, wonderful facility.
Back to the problems of the VFL. The distribution of gate receipts from VFL finals has, of course, been a subject of great debate over many years.
Yes, that's right, but as I said earlier, that when the thing first arose was when the trustees wanted to charge 15% in 1957 agreement, and the club was prepared to go along with the league at 12.5%. The trustees insisted, though, on the 15 because they've got the overall control there. The club even suggested to the league that they'd pay 2.5% difference in the gate receipts and make that as a payment to the league, but the trustees wouldn't agree to that. And I think the 12.5% would have been a more appropriate figure at the time. I'd just come into the game and I walked straight into those negotiations.
Pretty fiery baptism for you.
It was a fiery baptism, yes, but still those things happen.
And you rue the day because it was really the linchpin on which the going to Waverley occurred.
Oh, I don't think it was. I think that Ken Luke wanted to go to Waverley anyhow because he had an antipathy to the MCG. And the ironical thing about it, Ken always listed in Who's Who that he was a member of the MCC, and he never was.
Yeah. Not well known at all.
No, that's a fact.
Now, one of the considerations was that by charging greater subscriptions here, you could have still afforded to have all of the finals played at the MCG.
Well, that's possible, but then where do you draw the line? I mean, let's face it was only 7 guineas for a subscription in those days, but 7 guineas in 1956 was a lot more than 7 guineas or $15 today. And the fact is that we never had 50% of our members attend a grand final. So while you might say that the great appeal that it had, I think 48% was the most members we ever had. There were about 56% of ladies' tickets used. So that it was really only about half of the members turned up to the grand final. So that it wasn't quite the appeal that the league made out. And I think possibly, well, no, I don't think we could have paid more because as things were in those days, I don't think it would have been justified. I felt we made a proper and a fair deal in the thing. And remember this, that with putting up the subscriptions of the MCC, the fact is that we rely on the fact that a lot of the members don't use the facility. As I say, when we had half of the members here, or 48% of the members and 56% of the ladies' tickets, there were about 25,000 in the reserve, came into the reserve, and it only holds about 22,000, and lots of them went home. So we haven't got the accommodation to accommodate all of our members, and so you take a punt on there'll be some silent members. If you put your fee too high, you'll have fewer silent members. It's as simple as that.
Now, something you can reflect on only with pleasure, and that is the development of the MCC Cricket Museum.
Oh yes, that's been a great thing, and that came about by quite a fluke. Tony Bayer, a young Englishman, came out here in the 60s. He used to follow cricket all over the world. He used to follow the Australians to the West Indies. The only place he wouldn't go to was India because of his health. And the Australians had been good to him in the West Indies. We also looked after him here because he was a member of Marylebone. And he developed a liking for the club. And he told me that he would will this wonderful collection he had to the club when he died. Then later the collection grew so much it got too big for his flat. And he decided to give it to the club. He was going to give it on loan, but we wouldn't accept it on loan on the advice of Norman O'Brien, a QC who was on the committee. He was a Supreme Court judge too. And we said, no, we couldn't accept it on loan. So he said, oh, well, I'll make a gift of it to you. Well, of course, we hadn't seen it. And we thought, golly, oh, gee. And Ted Moran and Don Duffy, two of our committeemen, were going to England. We asked them to check the thing out and have a look at it for us to see if it was worthwhile having. And they wrote back and they both said, it's very, very good, it's this and it's that, and we should take it up. We took it up, and then the fun started. The committee lost a little bit of interest. We got hold of an old dining room we had on the upstairs of the pavilion. And one of the conditions about the collection was that it wouldn't be unpacked until Tony arrived, or Tony was here. I was in America at the time, and the thing arrived, and my wife and John Weikart took delivery. Tony arrived, so they started to unpack, the two of them. And Tony helped. He broke the first thing he took out, so he was barred. And anyhow, finally these two, Lal and John Weikart, unpacked the thing. We got the thing set up, and this is something about women power, Tony. We got it set up, and the committee was only lukewarm about it. They weren't terribly interested. And one night I had an idea, we'll have a cocktail party up in the museum. We invited the wives of the committeemen, and they saw it, and they went into ecstasies about it. And of course, as soon as they went into ecstasies, the committee got a newfound interest in the thing, and from then on it was just plain sailing, and everyone was very happy with it. And it is, of course, one of the finest collections in the world. It's absolutely superb. And we have to thank Tony Bayer for that.
Well, we've come full circle. Here we are on the eve of Australia's bicentenary, 12 years down the track, the turning of a century. Where will this institution be in those times? What is your vision of the future of the MCC?
Well, it started off on this ground. The MCC started off in 1837, only, what, 2 years, 1838, 3 years after Victoria was founded. It survived all of that time. This MCC is the third ground it had. Came here in 1853. It was acclaimed in 1871 when the English team were out here as the greatest cricket ground in the world. It's grown since then. I think it will continue to grow. It'll continue to add more comforts. It might reduce a little bit in accommodation. But I think it will be a focal point for all sporting events and all great events in Australia, not only Victoria, in Australia, into eternity. I think it's got a wonderful future, this place. It's been established, it's accepted, and, well, it's just a wonderful part of Melbourne and a credit to Melbourne and Australia.